Welcome everyone to another Saturday evening satsang. Well, Saturday evening for me. Thank you for joining. For those of you interested, I have now opened registration for the next online intensive, which starts in exactly a week's time, this time next Saturday. And the title of the intensive is From Separate to Non-Separate Recognition. And if you listen to most non-duality presentations and teachings, the emphasis is almost exclusively on a shift in consciousness, a shift in consciousness such that the subject is known to be different to what has been known previously. And what I mean by known directly because of the specific type of experiential, and it's important to note, experiential shift. So it isn't a knowledge of the intellect. It isn't just a grasping of what the subject is, meaning the true, the self. It isn't just a knowing of what the self is as an intellectual concept, but it's rather knowing it by being it. Now, the reason that non-dual teachings often take the approach of pointing at what we are, as they say, in reality, is because there isn't an availability, there isn't a connection, there isn't a living as, seeing the world from that perspective. And so bringing the change, the shift about can be a very significant part of the seeking process, not necessarily because that's the ultimate goal, but rather because the required changes that happen when teachings focus on the true, the real, the changes that happen as part of that process have a very significant effect on dissolving the structures that exist in the system, certain structures anyway, the structures that tend to be the ones that create the conceptual sense of self, which is often related to as the false idea of who we are and what we need and how things work and what life is. So those structures often get dismantled as a result of the shift that happens. Now, is that the only way that those structures can be dismantled? And I personally don't know, because my journey was from the top down, you could say, where the focus at the beginning was primarily on the self, the true self, understanding that what we really are, as the teachings would say, is formless consciousness or awareness, not separate from source, not different from source, and that the world of form is actually just a manifestation or a momentary arising within that which we are, like a dream made of what we are, not separate from what we are and recognized by what we are. We are not the body, is the approach that those teachings will take. So, is it the only way? As I said, it was my experience, but I have come in contact with people who I respect who report that suffering is not part of their life, and they don't describe a recognition of awareness, a self-recognition, and a shift to a subject that is formless, and yet still describe that suffering has come to an end. So my conclusion, my deduction is that the structures of the egoic self were dismantled in some other way. And that is a conclusion that I can sit quite happily with, because the perspective of witnessing life from a place of formless awareness, as far as my experience goes, and I really don't know where that fits in the scheme of things, but as far as my experience goes, what I call integration is a shift from witnessing consciousness back into an embodied form where one lives as the human being and not as formless awareness. And so the shift into the standpoint or the platform where it is felt that we are formless awareness, given that's not the embodied perspective, and what, from my experience, is not the final position, unless, of course, it goes back to that at some other stage in the journey. But assuming that the integration, which is the coming back down to earth, so to speak, which felt very much like a completion compared to the previous state of abiding as witnessing consciousness, that at some point there was an intuitive sense, there's something missing here. And then the journey was a sort of return journey back into the body. So given that that's the position from which life is lived, as far as my experience goes, the notion that the egoic structures could be dissolved some other way other than the process of shifting to witness consciousness makes complete sense to me, although it's not my experience. So having said all that, anyone who, I feel that journey and an exploration of those concepts are extremely powerful, even if it doesn't so much as bring about a shift in the conscious state. The topics that will be spoken about, as I mentioned, are very powerful at dissolving the psychological self. They're essential for dissolving the psychological self. So my thought with this intensive is not for it to necessarily be a space where someone is spontaneously going to have this shift into knowing themselves as awareness, which can be referred to as self-realization, the realization of the true self, although that could very easily happen given the explorations that we'll be running through. So even though it's not necessarily the intention to bring about that shift, which is not in my control or your control, it happens spontaneously when it happens. A lot of the topics, like discussing how language brings about experience, how it plays into our experiential experience of subject and object, and that's not necessarily often understood. That language is something that is almost fundamental. It isn't really fundamental, but it gets put in place at such a young age, and it labels everything as objects, and it creates a label for the self, and that language then positions everything as separate. And it doesn't surprise me that that then can influence the experience. And so as language is seen for what it is, and the world of form is then able to be seen independent of language, meaning we only label the world of form after, as a secondary movement. If all the labels that we have learned to project onto the world of form are not applied, then there still is that which is there regardless of whether it's labeled or not. And we can, through that exploration, come to see that ideas of good and bad, for example, success or failure, worthiness or unworthiness, all of these notions are relative concepts relative to specific benchmarks. And if we find ourselves pulling out of that conceptual relativity, then there is much less of an obstacle, an internal structural obstacle, language, which is not seen clearly until there's an exploration of it. When that is seen clearly, there's much less of an obstacle for the experience to shift into what is often described as direct knowing. And that is direct knowing that transcends concepts, that can transcend the intellect, and in fact transcends the conceptual self that gets set up because language is not seen from the perspective that delineates it from what is. The two become merged, and so essentially we are projecting a thought-based reality over the actual what is. So the Rumi, there's a little Rumi poem talking about a field. There is a field out there. And within that, it refers to something like beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. So what that's pointing at, it's saying beyond the intellectual overlay of good or bad, and we know that good or bad is relative to what we want or what we like, what we expect, what society wants, likes, expects, or simply relative to our biological preferences. And so if we step out of that paradigm and set a much broader benchmark, then we might even find that the notion of right and wrong, good and bad falls away, and we're left with, we could use the concept of perfection, however it is, but even that, you wouldn't even label it perfection. It is seen to be as it is, and from a high enough perspective, meaning zooming out of the personal, the idea of it transcends the notion of perfect or not perfect. That's the whole point, is that what is exists independent of our ideas about it and our labels of it. So that's an example of some of the things that we'll go through that can uh, deconstruct certain constructs that exist in our system that force us to see to experience life as separate. Me versus the other. Me, and then all of the objects seen or heard or smelt or tasted, touched. And this shift in consciousness reveals that there is that consciousness or awareness actually transcends this body, the body that we have always known, because the body that we've always known is within the experience. And the shift in consciousness is really quite profound, such that it becomes directly experienced, that that which is aware is fundamental and primordial to the body. The experience can't be that experience of awareness being primordial to the body, meaning that the body is just an object within awareness. It cannot create that experience. That experience couldn't be created if, in fact, the body was primary. And I'm talking about the body that is within the experience. Now, there might be some body that is primary, is prior to awareness, but it is not this body. And frankly, that is not something that, generally speaking, in life prior to these shifts, that is not something that is that people have a first-hand experience of. And so it just has to be, let's say, believed at best. It's described often and it's believed at best. And so that belief is not enough to dissolve the structures, the egoic structures that create a sense of being something we're not, and subsequently create the suffering that arises in life. And so if that shift in perspective happens, then the universe or life has delivered some radical information that is a game changer. Because it is then known that awareness is primary to the body and not secondary from the body. And so then the implication of that knowing reverberates through the whole system and deconstructs anything that it is not aligned with, any beliefs that it's not aligned with. So I'm shifting in between satsang and reminding people that the intensive is on. So anyone who wants to join this intensive, which is 6 consecutive days, 6 2-hour sessions, registration is on the website, rogercastillo.org, under the events tab. I did want to continue with a couple of these more nuanced parts, not necessarily separate to non-separate recognition, but some nuances that sometimes get overlooked. However, I also appreciate that a lot of the nuances that might not generally get spoken about when question and answers happen. And I know last week there were 2 hands up, and I said I would come to them first off this week. I don't know if those hands are, those questions are still relevant. I see Francois has his hand up. So in the meantime, we'll go to Francois.
Can you hear me, Roger?
Yes, yes, I can. Welcome.
Okay, okay. Yeah. So, hello, Roger. And
Hello.
as always, when I want to speak, I start first. That's the way it is. Um, in fact, I had a very personal question about something that it's very, uh, as you talk about, the top-down teaching and the bottom-up teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I was aware about something because I'm in touch with Sophie, that you know. You know who I'm talking about, Sophie, a
Yes,
French girl
yes.
that came, and Didier Weiss, that I already talked to you about.
Mm-hmm.
And Sophie talked to me about the fact that, in fact, you were quite enough close to Didier, that you were almost friends. And I was wondering if when you see him, sometimes do you talk about the teachings or you talk about something else because you are in different position? And I was wondering how you deal with what he is and what he's teaching. And if you mention you, I will say disagreement on certain things, or if you don't.
Yeah, well, Didier was kind enough to invite me to, and his lovely wife Cecilia as well, kindly to invite me um, to Pondicherry, where they held some non-dual talks for interested people, and I think that was probably before Didier was doing so much teaching. He was with Ramesh in the days earlier than I was, and at that stage, Ramesh, I think, was taking more of a top-down approach before he had brought it right down to practical daily living. So there are differences in the teaching for sure. The perspective, as far as I understand, that Didier takes is, we are consciousness, and so any reference to the person um, is at best, just how it appears. And I can accept that as a valid perspective. Uh, and so if you're talking, it's important that when we're talking, we talk from a certain level. So one thing makes sense from one level. And from a different level, the concept would be different. So an example of that is if we're saying what we are is consciousness, then someone could say consciousness has complete free will. It would be ridiculous to suggest that the creator source, has no free will. And if we come down to a level of talking to the ego, then we might say, the ego has no free will, or even the person as a separate independent entity, because really that entity doesn't really exist. But seeker often believes that's what they are. And so then you would say, you, what you believe you are, has no free will. So I think it is simply a matter of reconciling that what is said from different, or is there are levels, not levels of hierarchy, but points of view or perspectives from where something is being described. And so the concepts will be completely different, in fact, almost oppositional. One will say you have complete free will, the other says you have absolutely no free will. So they sound irreconcilable. And yet, if we see that they are talking from a different perspective, then it can be seen that they are not contradictions or disagreements, but they are complementary, and sit very well together. Another example is, from the perspective of consciousness, the world doesn't exist. You could say, from the top-down teachings, the world is unreal, the world doesn't exist. And what it's really saying is the world of form doesn't exist. Whereas if we come down to the level of form and talk about enlightenment in practical daily living terms, and then we have to relate to ourselves as somewhat the vehicle in practice. We continue to get into a car and have a perspective of life from the vehicle's point of view. And we relate to objects as if they are real, because in practice, if you were to, run into a wall, some feedback happens that says this exists. So that would be my answer, is that I don't see a disagreement, because I just see that they're descriptions from different perspectives.
Okay. But according to you, do you feel that Didier have the disagreement and doesn't feel that it's complementary?
Sorry, do I think?
Yeah. Do you feel that for you it's like this because your teaching includes the both side, but in the teaching of someone like Didier Weiss, and according to what I think I know about different teachings, they don't see these two parts. They see only one part. So what you can see as no disagreement and complementary, they may not feel it the same way. And that was my question. If, in fact, have you talked sometimes with Didier about your each point of view, and did you feel that he did agree with you that it was complementary, or he was like you were wrong?
We did have discussion, and I don't. It was a long time ago. I don't think we had. I don't think we reached complete agreement. But what I think was very evident is that we were both happy to agree that we didn't reach agreement. Okay. And that's a much more important point, because it shows that both people were not involved in something that ultimately is not so important. Having even if let's say two people who are teaching, even if one of them has some of the detail wrong because of the way that they see it from a relative perspective, or the way that it gets processed is missing something. As long as that is just as long as it's sort of like just decoration, it's not fundamental. It's not a fundamental misunderstanding. And that the attitude is, really, it's not so important what someone else thinks. Or even imagine if you say, it's not even really important if I'm wrong. That's one of the, and so that was one of the nuances I wanted to talk about today. And there were lots of little things. If we become clear on the different forms of suffering, and sometimes a doubt might arise inside a seeker. A lot of pieces set in and in, but a doubt comes in about, have I really understood something? Have I really understood this, or am I misunderstanding? If the intellect of that seeker is clear on what the different forms of suffering are, and if the system, once it realizes that the doubt itself is a form of suffering coming in to the moment. So before the doubt arose, there was peace of mind. And then if they start worrying or having a doubt about their understanding, if the system sees that question, have I understood, is the problem. It's not that it needs an answer. We don't need to have an answer. Have I understood or have I misunderstood? If the system cuts the question off, we get to see it is the question. In this case, it's a question, but really it's the suffering, whatever form of suffering arises. That's the problem. So if the system cuts it off, my conclusion is it has been understood correctly. Because if things hadn't been understood correctly, that doubt wouldn't get cut off. Now, if things have really been understood fully, the doubt wouldn't even arise. But if we've understood things 95%, let's say, you just arbitrary for the example, then you might have a little doubt comes out and then gets cut off. And so we know, okay, it's been understood more or less. And then when the doubt stops arising, you don't even have the question. You don't have the question: have I understood or misunderstood? So the understanding then transcends. Have I got it right? Have I got it wrong? It transcends. I can't remember what you had just used about. It transcends. Does someone agree with me or disagree with me? And I think that's really the point we have to grasp. Otherwise, we'll be trying to sort out all sorts of, things that thankfully are irrelevant.
Yeah, it was my experience. So once when I was really in my peace of mind, as I could be now, most of the time, and I really didn't care about if I was right. It was just very strange feelings to just not care about something that used to care a lot. If I was correct about my analysis and all this, it was very strange to feel like I don't care. I just feel good. Mm-hmm. And if I can add questions to my first introduction, is do you think it could be possible that there is a different, I will say, liberation to get to this end of suffering, but different way, as we know, but still very specific to certain organism, certain human body. And so that maybe someone like Didier or some other people who are in the consciousness, and they really feel like they don't suffer because of the distance with the suffering, and that will be enough for the rest of their life, because it will stay stable, even if in your concept it's not stable. because suffering is still there? Do you think they can be like it's enough and it will be enough and they will stay in this state of witnessing?
Well, I can talk to my experience, and I had something that needed to happen when I was in that state of witnessing. And to make it clear, when I say the state of witnessing, there were very many realizations or shifts, experiential, direct knowings, knowing oneself as formless awareness, then a more embodied knowing oneself as the being aspect, and then the awareness and the being aspect coming together so that they were less distinguishable than in the first when they presented separately. And then that became a much more embodiment into being Roger. And all of that happened, or not all of it, the coming back down happened specifically with Ramesh. When I met Ramesh, it just happened to be that his teaching was very much focused on living as if you are the person, because essentially that is what this creation is. This is a creation of being a person, forgetting one's connection to source, which really means being not in contact with consciousness, an awakening to the consciousness that we were disconnected from, although it was still functioning through us, an awakening to it. And that often feels as, that you are not the person. And then a coming back and continuing to live as Roger, as if I am Roger in practical terms, because we can't escape that, right? You can't escape the fact that until the body dies, consciousness is somehow, in whichever way, linked. The experience is very much an experience from the perspective of a particular body mind, even if the sense is that what I am transcends and is primary to the body, that the body is secondary, it is not the source. Even if that is actually the case, which intuitively I would run with that consciousness is primordial, is not coming from the body, but rather functioning through the body. So even if the witnessing perspective as it presents is true, the fact is, if the hands cover the eyes, the hands of the body cover the eyes, that witnessing, what the witnessing consciousness witnesses, is affected by the fact that the eyes have gone over that the hands have gone over the eyes. So even if we live as witnessing consciousness, if we abide in that, we can't deny that there is a link to a singular body in the apparent manifestation of life. And so from that point of view, I think it made complete sense to me that, the completion is to live as if I am Roger. And so that, what does that as if mean? It's not that you just pretend to be Roger. It's like, oh no, this is how this manifestation has been created. And then my description is Roger is a combination of a vehicle, the body, that has intellect, and a consciousness that is not from the body, but functioning through the body. And that consciousness is aware of life from the perspective of the body, and that consciousness is connected to source, and source is the creator of everything, the body and the world. So when I say I am Roger, that what Roger encompasses includes consciousness, ultimately consciousness as source. So I don't see I don't see a problem. I forgot what your initial question was, though.
My question was, can you think it's a possibility that, in fact, the process of liberation is not as much universal? It's the same goal, the end of suffering, but it will be through maybe the state of witnessing in some case, and it will stay stable enough. And for people like you and I, it will be through the non-doership and all these energy reloads that get out of the organism, and that it will be not one enlightenment, I will say. It will be like different possibility according to the destiny and what is useful for each human.
Yeah, well, definitely the expression of it can, yeah, look, I have no reason to doubt that the expression could be different. I, even as you describe it, I don't think it is different, because really the manifestation in practical terms, what I would say is, you know, where the rubber hits the road. I think Adyashanti had used this saying. I had heard it. Then where the rubber hits the road, which is really saying from a practical point of view, knowing oneself, being oneself, in practical terms, manifests as the end of suffering. So if someone has the end of suffering as the witnessing consciousness, or someone has end of suffering as embodied and in happy to say, I am Roger. As long as it, what would be argued is that the peace of mind is of a different order or a different nature, and often I think it's the person who's not a person, if they were to say that, who lives as witnessing consciousness, or insists that that is that there is no other perspective that can be valid. If someone, if we can't even say if someone, because they're saying there is no one. And so this is my point. You see how impractical it is. But anyway, that doesn't mean it's wrong, but it means that from a practical point of view, we should be able to say differently. But if that's not a valid concept from that other perspective, then they will often, I think, say, your peace of mind is a relative peace of mind. The argument would be, and I'm not saying this about Didier, for example, because I don't remember I don't remember if we went into that, but I do know, I've seen enough out there to understand where I think some of the misunderstandings that I've seen other people, or when I've seen other people talk about this, I think they simply can't comprehend that someone who's talking from a relative point of view using dualistic language, and using concepts of good and bad, for example, I think it's very hard for them to comprehend that that is complementary to the realization that transcends concepts. And so then the conclusion would be, oh, your peace of mind is just a justification. It is just an intellectual movement that is cutting off suffering or pushing suffering down as part of an intellectual justification, that it needs a concept to counter the suffering. Whereas I would say no, that's not the peace of mind that is happening. The peace of mind that is happening is, at the end of the day, if someone were to talk about their suffering, if my response is, wow, isn't it funny how different our experiences are? That, worry, for example, if it just simply doesn't arise. So it isn't a question of then, which I think a lot of people who would disagree with this practical perspective, their argument would be, you are continually having to deal with suffering with the intellect, and that is not true end of suffering. And I would say, yes, I would agree. If that was the case, it's not the end of suffering. But if the suffering simply does not arise in the system, I say it's fundamentally the system has the untrue parts, let's say, the untrue parts have been dismantled. So yes, different pathways for sure.
Yeah. And last question, and after I let you with the other people. During your retreat in Bali, if I have by destiny get the chance to be there, not at your retreat, but in Bali during this time period, or at least 1 week in this time period, could I be able to come to some of your satsang with any fees it will cost? But even if I'm not a part of the retreat,
there
or
are
could I see you
complications.
at least? Tell me.
I'm sure we can manage something, but there are complications with the way the retreat has to be structured, in terms of I have to essentially take a group with me, not necessarily all in the same plane, but so it really does need to be part of the retreat, the people that come, because of visas and things like that. But I'm sure we can work something out. At very least, we can meet up. But it's
Okay. If I'm a chance to be over there for, I will say, my own vacation, holidays, and I know that you are in Hubud. That's what you say, huh? In Hubud in Bali, and I have the chance
yes, yeah,
to see you in live. I think I will be pleased to do so.
yeah.
So that just
I'm sure
if
we can
there is a
work something
possibility.
out. There's
Okay.
something will be worked out. So that would be a pleasure. But mind you, that retreat is still conceptual at this stage. It hasn't been
Okay.
confirmed. So we will see.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
Very
Thank you,
good.
Roger, for everything.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks, Francois.
And I think just to finish, I think you are the most useful tool I have ever met in my life.
Thank you. It's well, it's all I know how to do.
Yeah. Thank you much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So a couple of other comments that had arisen during the week, questions, comments from people. One person wrote that they said the pointers are profound, but then they went on to say, but really I can't see. I'm not sure on what basis they say the pointers are profound, because the next part said that they really can't see how one can be at peace, given that the flow of life is pleasure and pain, and that at best they can see that someone could resign to the fact that life is pleasure and pain, but in a way, a bitter resignation. It's unsatisfactory that life is, the pain part was the bit that they said they couldn't reconcile peace of mind and pain, especially if it is a significant pain. Not talking about the small pains where you, I don't know, break a vase that you like, or a meal that you order isn't up to standard. That, we can get over. But what about significant pains like unable to pay your way in life and end up being homeless, or physical pain that is illness that is severe? The question was, I disagree with this notion of peace of mind. I simply cannot see how one can be at peace when life is painful. And so the reason I'm saying this is I think it's a good question to illustrate the point. Now, I can really empathize with where the question is coming from. It's coming from their experience. So what they're saying is, I have a huge amount of suffering that arises in my life in relation to the pains that are present in life. That's where the question is coming from. And they're saying that peace of mind is so, the concept of peace of mind regardless of circumstance is irreconcilable as a concept that they are hearing. It's irreconcilable with their experience. And what I mean by their experience is the inner experience in relation to the outer circumstance, what actually arises for them. And so what I would say is it possible that your experience, which you're working off, and the logic that emanates from your system is specific to your system, and that another system, not necessarily every other system, because clearly suffering is a common manifestation in life. But is it possible that some other system is structured differently such that peace of mind and the pleasures and pains of life are not contradictories, but complementary? And my explanation is that that is only possible when the psychological self, the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, which in practical terms, those beliefs deeply ingrained that sort of were put in place layer over layer over layer over layer, and then day after day created the sense of who we are at a very young age, a toddler age. So, at some point, the toddler goes from seeing a world as an appearance without a me, and then suddenly a me appears at the age of 2.5 or 3, and the me is, that's mine. You took it away, and so there's a tantrum because what was theirs gets taken away. Whereas prior to that, the baby would cry if there was pain of different sorts, but there was no notion of me and mine, me and the other. And at some point that gets put in place. And that identity, depending on its structure, is the identity from where suffering comes. And the concepts in the teaching say that that suffering is psychological in nature. And so if that psychological structure dissolves, and if in fact the truth, the reality is that the human being includes an essence that transcends the human being, an essence that in reality was never born and will never die. And that essence can know itself in that invulnerability. not as some sort of mental gymnastics. I'm saying, what if that is the actuality? And what gets in the way is a structure that gets built around that essence, a structure that has the capacity to obscure a knowing of the fundamental characteristics of that essence. And using language is limited, so characteristics might not be the perfect word. I mean, the fundamentalness of that essence might be that it is self-content, that it is self-affirming, and that circumstance is not an attack on that essence. It doesn't add or subtract from the essence. And if that's the case, then it makes sense that there is a potential for pleasure and pain to exist, and for the psychological self, or I'll say it differently, and that on the level of self, and in this case, it would be the real self as opposed to the psychological self, that pleasure and pain can exist. That is on the level of the physical, or on the level of the body and the intellect, you could say. And that the real self is untouched by that. And because of that, there is the potential for there to be acceptance. And that is really what peace of mind is, which acceptance means a deep recognition that life on a certain level is relative to the body. Pleasure and pain. Why I say relative to the body? Because it's the body that has the biological preferences that make some things feel painful and some things pleasurable. So with that essence revealing itself or knowing itself, because the obstacles, the structures that were there have collapsed, there is a clarity that life is pleasure or pain, but not in a bitter resignation way, because it doesn't, the fact that life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain is not of the same consequence experientially. So how it's known is not of the same consequence as it is when the psychological self is in place. And so we have to sometimes look at our experience and understand that it is a relative experience, meaning it is an experience from a particular point of view and experience influenced by certain structures that we weren't in control of, but that are in place. And so then projecting outward to all other experiences, or assuming that that is the only possibility available, would be a critical thinking error. And so I would suggest to the person who wrote the comment, and I think they wrote it in good faith, wanting an explanation. So this is my explanation. I would suggest that holding one's own experience as relative and realizing this is whether this happens. So this explanation hopefully is new conditioning that allows one to appreciate, yes, from my experience, the concept of peace of mind seems unfathomable, because there is no peace of mind with the notion of pain. Pain is seen to be an attack on who I am, which then means we can conclude there must be very strong identification with the body and the ideas, the beliefs of what is needed, that causes this disconnect from the essence that, forget about what I say, that is described in many different places as the self, the true self, that is formless, and that and the nature of which is peace of mind. We only say peace of mind, so I think that's another thing that some others would have objection to. They say, you see, it's a peace of the mind. Now, I say peace of mind because the peace itself is not a mental peace. It's not a mental justification of things, which is what someone might interpret when they hear the word, it's peace of mind. They might think it's just a way of doing mental gymnastics to feel okay on a mental level. But I'm sure they would agree. This is, let's say, another teacher. If I say it's called peace of mind because the natural peace of the self is what exists when the thinking mind of the psychological self is deconstructed. And so peace of mind really means the absence of the thinking mind. And in the absence of the thinking mind, there is no need for the presence of any intellectual concepts to bring about peace of mind. So peace of mind is the nature of the self. Should anyone have any questions or comments, feel free to raise your hands. Otherwise, I'll just carry on. This last point is particularly important that it gets mentioned because the approach that this teaching takes in part is to describe the workings of life using concepts. And in fact, a lot of teachings, the ones that would have objection with what might be put forward here, focus on bringing an end, at least temporarily, to thinking. And so thinking and thought will be described as, and mind you, I think this is a very powerful technique. I try to utilize where possible both approaches. So the certain top-down teachings will demonize thought as the problem, and in a way doing so in practical terms throws the baby out with the bathwater, because concepts can be very useful tools. However, it doesn't matter that the baby's being thrown out with the bathwater. In fact, that's only a description from the perspective of a teaching where certain concepts of the working mind, not of the thinking mind, are being utilized as a tool. So throwing the baby out with the bathwater is only a perspective from another teaching's point of view, because the teaching that is essentially dismissing thinking altogether and making that something that we need to stop doing for a while, is using a technique that that approaches the problem from a different way, it's a different methodology. And so the continuous pointer that says it is the mind, it is thinking, that is the problem. You will never know the self through thought. That's correct, right? That there's nothing incorrect with that. And in fact, in a way, the two teachings, if we can get to the bottom of it, are really saying the same thing, because when we look at the teachings of non-doership, it spends a lot of time describing the movement of suffering and describing what suffering is and on what basis it stems, and trying to highlight through concepts that the basis of the suffering can be shown to be false, which then should undermine the suffering. And so all of the concepts are ultimately pointing at a silence of the thinking mind, but doing it in a way where the intellect realizes at some point, oh, all of these concepts that in a way can be used as food for thinking, but they're a very specific food. They're a food that is talking specifically to the working mind, which is the functional mind, not the ego, not the psychological self. And at some point, that intellect will realize, I have to shut up, and that brings an end to the intellect's thinking. And if that is realized, it also means that the structure of the psychological self has been significantly undermined, and the movement of the psychological self, which is never to shut up, it's always going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. If that's realized in the system, first on the working mind side, but that realization permeates through, and the thinking, the working mind, the functional part of our intellect, then starts cutting off the psychological movements of thought. And that leads to silence. So if a teaching, on the other hand, says, most people they can't hold that much information in a way that is useful, and especially hold it in a way that where the system doesn't become completely identified with the information and then hold on to it as what is truth, rather than transcending ultimately the information. And so they say, we're not even going to give concepts, because frankly, concepts are what are fundamental to the involvement. Specific concepts that have been turned into beliefs, like I am the body, and I'm nothing else other than the body, and I need life to be like this. Concepts based on how life is experienced. And so those concepts are relative, based on how the experience is at a particular point in time, and they're locked away and that becomes part of a feedback loop that makes that identity stronger and stronger. And so the other teachings will say, thinking is the problem. Just stop thinking. Any thinking about how life works, how you think life works, all of that is relative. It's wrong. The truth lies outside of thought. And that's powerful. That's a powerful teaching. I'm not sure where I was going. I probably started a thought and didn't finish it, but that's life. Now, Melissa had her hand up, and then Tom.
Yes. Hi, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Melissa.
Hi. It's so nice to be with you again. So for me, it's been a number of years that I've been contemplating the non-dual path, and it's definitely there's an evolution that is occurring, and I've increasingly I've seen that the the three components that are um, described by uh, Sravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana are very powerful. Hearing the teaching, thinking deeply about teaching, and then what's called meditating or uh, um, feeling into. That's the way I experience it. Feeling the truth of the teaching permeating uh, aspects of my um, perceiving experience, and so uh, um, I see how uh, it can it what can arise is that um, that I guess what we would call the mind uh, can be reconditioned. The conditioning can change. The mind is not set in stone. I mean, ultimately, there really is no such thing as mind. There's only a flow of thoughts, and that flow of thoughts is um, it's influenced, of course, by the conditioning that has come to be in place by many years of reinforcement, you might say. But by the same token, that conditioning can change, can move in a different direction. The previous conditioning can decondition, and a new conditioning can arise. And as that occurs, a, a, a different flow of thought and a different flow of experience can emerge. And so first, do you agree with that?
Yes. Ideally, it's so new conditioning that undoes the problematic old conditioning, rather than new conditioning that acts as the solution. So there's it's a big difference. It can seem like a subtle difference, but really at the end, I guess what I'm saying there is that ultimately the concept, any concept that has been useful, becomes irrelevant at some point, because the concept is really useful at undoing its opposite concept, and then both the concepts have no purpose. And Ram and I used a very nice metaphor, and it was use one thorn to remove the thorn that is embedded in your thumb, but then be sure to throw both thorns away. And the reason that that is said is that inevitably, as part of the process, as part of the process, inevitably, one thorn is used to remove the other thorn, but inevitably it gets embedded because we think that is the understanding. And so Ramana's pointer is saying, be sure that that second thorn that was so useful gets thrown away.
Yeah, yes, I'm familiar with that teaching. Somewhere along the line, I think I had learned that was originally from Nisargadatta. Maybe it's even further back than that. I think I may have even seen it in some of Ramana Maharshi's teaching as well. So who knows how far back, but it's very, very useful, of course. And I don't disagree. But I find that in my experience that that the flow of thoughts, which I'm going to call, which I call as, for the time being, a sense of mind, seems to need, or seems to express some kind of conditioning at a time, but that to remain open to the possibility that the conditioning can be continually flexible, so that as new understanding deepens, that even the current, whatever the current conditioning is, it can change again and again and again. I haven't yet experienced a sense of mind that is completely devoid of any conditioning, but I find that the current conditioning allows me to feel much freer and more at peace and less attached to particular outcomes. So it seems to be a workable hypothesis, shall we say, at the present time.
Yeah. So Ramesh used to say that's the benefit of this teaching, that even if full liberation doesn't eventuate, the concepts are concepts that by their nature can bring about a relative peace, or a reduction of suffering, for different reasons to that which is full liberation. But even in between, if the movement is towards full liberation, the concepts that are ultimately deconstructing the opposite held beliefs in the system, on the way to full liberation, there will be the use of the concepts as tools that cut off the suffering, and then create more peace, because the suffering is being cut off quicker than it would otherwise. And those concepts can refine themselves and change. We might start off believing, having an idea of a certain God, and that idea of God is still useful at cutting off or changing the belief structure that causes suffering. And then at some point we might realize, I'm running around with an idea of a God that, as more critical thinking comes in, is probably not a God that exists. And so then our idea of God changes because of new conditioning, either our own internally generated new conditioning or an external new conditioning that brings about a change in our idea of a God. And so we see an evolution of our concepts as you're describing. And so then the new concepts can cut off suffering and have a bit more of an effect on the problematic structure. And let's say we have an evolution of those concepts, and eventually the structure falls away, the suffering, the structure that from which suffering emanates. And at that point, we will find that the concepts become irrelevant, and it's useful for us to realize that the true peace, and so we should be able to see this along the way, the true peace, because along the way there will be periods where there just is peace, which is a very simple thing. It's a very ordinary thing. We might miss it because it doesn't feel particularly special, which is why I think it's important to have peace of mind described as simply the absence of suffering, no great sense of peace, like not bathing in a sense of peace. That's not the basic peace of mind that's available. That's a pleasurable peace of mind, or a pleasurable sense of peace. So along the way, we should have periods where we realize, oh, this is peace of mind because I don't have uncomfortable thoughts about the past, about the future, worries, and that it's not concept based. It's not, I don't need a concept for this peace to be here. In fact, this peace is outside of the realm of thinking. And so recognizing that means that the concepts that are cutting off the suffering thoughts, we see, oh, that isn't the source of peace. That is a tool that is cutting off suffering and affecting the suffering structure. And effectively, when the suffering structure has been completed, you don't need the tool. So there are these pointers, once you've got to the other side of the river, don't carry the boat on your back.
Yes.
And something to do with tools as well, don't
Yes.
carry the tools around. And that's exactly what it's pointing at.
Yes. I agree with all of that. I think one of the thoughts, if I may continue just for a few moments more, one of the thoughts that has fairly recently arisen that has helped me to put all of this reconceptualization more fully into alignment is the following. I have a background in biology and medicine, and it in my contemplating, it occurred to me that I began to think about, when an infant is first born, there is no mind yet. The mind has not, you might say, hasn't arisen. There really aren't any thoughts. There's no language. There's just a flow of pure perception in the newborn infant. There is a preference, an inborn preference for a kind of homeostasis. The infant prefers to be warm. It prefers to be full, fed. It prefers to not have the body in some kind of pain situation. But there really isn't any mind per se. the mind gradually it's a conditioning process um, uh, as the as the the body apparatus gradually comes to be uh, integrated into a gradually emerging sense of I, but there isn't even an I conceptually to begin with. So none of that conditioning, you might say, we don't arrive with any of that conditioning. The ground state, so to speak, is if you will, a piece of mind because there is no mind yet.
Yeah, I agree. But we wouldn't want to stay in that state.
Right.
So it's so you're
Right.
absolutely before the intellect, and I'd prefer to use the intellect. Mind, when I use it, sometimes I use mind interchangeable with thinking, but really I think mind is a synonym for consciousness, i.e., sound, image, all arises in mind, and thought and emotion arise in mind. If something doesn't arise in mind, it is not known in experience.
Okay.
So
yes.
I would more particularly use the word intellect. So as an infant, the intellect is undeveloped, especially from a conditioned point of view. So the hardware may be there in large part, but the conditioning, the software hasn't been uploaded. And as the software is uploaded, and that software, it's not only conditioning from the parents that say, you know, your name is John, but it's conditioning from the experience. So there's a feedback loop from the experience that the baby is having. And so what you speak of is correct in that when the baby is first born, you can see certain movements where the baby can hold its own hand, and there doesn't seem to be a recognition that that is what it is. So you could imagine that there is this sort of out of body awareness that is aware of everything, and without there being a link, you could say, or an identification with the body yet. And as the repeated sense conditioning happens to the body, the signals that go up to the brain sort of create a boundary through touch, multiple touch over months and years. And then, and the sense, oh, at some point, I think the baby realized, oh, this has something to do with me. So that comes in. Now, you wouldn't want to be left in the state that a baby is in at the very beginning, because that is devoid of so much of human experience. As the body develops, the capacity to interact and to connect develops. And so really, it isn't, in my view, a regression back to the baby state that happens, but rather the problematic structures that came into play as part of the conditioning, or specific, because of specific conditioning, they get dissolved. And so I've said in the past, you know, sometimes people say, I wish I could be deconditioned, as in have no conditioning. And I'd say, be careful what you wish for, because, you know, so many of the functions in life that we need to be able to continue to carry out, driving a car, washing yourself, eating, cooking, walking, talking, are all conditioned movements. So they're conditions on the level of the body, biological conditioning, or still this is biological conditioning, but if we say the working mind that can calculate, how much money you need to take on holiday, etc., etc., that type of thinking is not the problematic sort of thinking. It's the psychological thinking mind that's the problematic stuff. So yes, without the intellect and without conditioning, we wouldn't have a problem, but it's a double-edged sword. And so we want some and not some of the rest.
Right, I completely agree that so much of the richness of experience that is the nature of this so-called body mind or so-called human experience, so much of it would be lost in that case. So yes, I completely agree. I think after your satsang last week, the thought that arose was similar to the saying, first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. Could also be reformulated as, first there is a person, or a person that arises in babyhood, shall we say. First there is a person, then there is no person, then there is. But the person in the third stage is worlds apart from the person that was first conditioned to believe in the limited sense of I. So that's
Ramana used to say the ego of a sage is like the remnants of a burnt rope. And so I think that points to what you're talking about. He didn't say the sage has no ego, because it's the ego that continues to live its life. It's just that it's an ego in a very different form. So more specifically in this teaching, we would say the ego of a sage no longer has the deeply ingrained beliefs of attachment to outcomes and the belief in personal doership. So that part of the ego has collapsed, and what you're then left with is an ego that is a shadow of its former self. It is an ego that can't, if we use the metaphor of the rope, can't tie itself up and can't tie other people up in blame and in judgment, self-judgment, etc. So there is an ego of the sage, but it is, as you said, far different in quality to what it was before the transformation took place.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, Roger. This is such a delight to participate in. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. You're very welcome. Thanks for joining. And Tom, you're next.
Oh, hi, Roger.
Hello, welcome.
Hi. Yeah, I'm unable to unmute, but that's okay. I wanted to ask about anxiety.
Sure.
Yeah, I've written some notes. So, my experience of anxiety is that it's a habit of overthinking, catastrophizing, worrying, that results in like a chronic the system, being chronically flooded with adrenaline or an excess of adrenaline, and it's one of the more extreme forms of suffering. I think I've heard you say that. Ultimately, it's harmless, but it's deeply uncomfortable. So do you have any thoughts on that at all? And how does that relate to this understanding?
Well, anxiety is described as one of the forms of suffering. So guilt, blame, pride, worry, and anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcome. And the first three are more related to doership, and the last two are more related, you could say, to outcomes. But then the doership also interplays into that. So the anxiety is really an anxiety about outcomes. And the anxiety is then amplified because we feel we need to solve the problem, fix, prevent things from happening, or yeah, that sort of movement. It isn't something that a doer, that a doer is doing per se. So Tom isn't creating the anxiety. The anxiety is happening as part of the structure that exists within Tom's body-mind organism, primarily what we would call a psychological structure. And that psychological structure, because it's a movement of thought, and in that psychological structure, consciousness is very identified. The structure itself forces an identification of the consciousness that really is independent of the thoughts, independent in a certain regard. But that particular structure sort of forces the consciousness to become identified with the thoughts. And so hence you end up with the feeling that I am the thinker, I am the one that is causing the anxiety. And then a whole lot of consequential thoughts is like, why can't I fix this? Why don't I stop this? Which can cause, more angst. And so the description that I'm giving here may be useful. Not that Tom can't do anything that I'm saying, but the new conditioning can have a consequence. And that consequence is happening not on the level of Tom the doer, because there is no Tom the doer. There is a mechanism that, as Melissa was saying, is influenced by new conditioning. And so this new conditioning can influence the mechanism that is different, separate from Tom. The mechanism is what is causing the movements. And if that mechanism is affected, then the movements of anxiety, for example, can change. So one of the most important bits of information, which is the new conditioning potentially that I'm putting forward, is anxiety is like any form of the other forms of suffering, is something that is happening, not something that Tom is doing. And from a certain, if the experience is structured a certain way, there may be no frame of reference from which that makes any sense because of the identification that might be happening. It might seem, from within the experience, it might seem like, I just don't know what you mean. However, I also think within the way that anxiety arises, it can, where it's completely overwhelming and completely out of your control to affect it sometimes, that it might be extremely obvious that this is a happening that you are not doing. In theory, if you were doing it, you could affect it, change it, do it differently. And I'm sure you would love to do it differently, because anxiety is so uncomfortable on the level of self. So the recognition that it is a happening, it's there, right? It is arising within a body-mind organism, and it is a consequence of a structure. And if you remember putting the structure in place, in the way you might build a house, then that would be bad news. But the reality is that we might understand why the structure got put in place. We might see the sequence of cause and effect. Hopefully we realize that cause and effect was essentially conditioning, shaping a body-mind organism to be a certain way. And so this understanding can sink in deeper and deeper and deeper, even if so first it needs to be understood just intellectually, and then that intellectual understanding, as we observe what is understood intellectually, so the observation of the intellectual pointers for ourselves based on our own experience, time and time again, i.e., the thought might arise, this anxiety truly is it's just come out of nowhere. It wasn't happening, and now it's happening. And it's happening because of, and you might see past conditioning or genetic similarities or patterns in your family. And if that is registered in a particular way that really reinforces on a more than intellectual level, but on a scene level, where you just simply come to see the structure of how life has put things in place, and how anxiety is a completely expected consequence of a particular structure that life put in place, then there can be, in time, a perspective that sets in, a real perspective, not just an intellectual perspective, but a perspective that stands apart from the anxiety. Because the anxiety, maybe this is something that might happen, not something that Tom can do, but something that is a consequence if a certain introspection happens alongside certain concepts. Something, and that something is what we really are, starts to find itself standing apart from the anxiety itself. And that is the movement of the one, anxiety being objectified, meaning turned into an object, because the concept says it is an energy that is arising. It comes out of nowhere and appears, and it's simply a consequence of genes and up-to-date conditioning, the only two factors that cause things to be within our system, and two factors you had no control over. And that, if it is seen over and over, don't try and do it. It's either going to happen just as you're going through life, or it's not. Does cause a disidentification of consciousness from the objects that it has been forced to identify with. And one of those objects is thought. So it is, in the case of anxiety, we can start off, it's the feeling that might be more relevant than the thoughts. But ultimately, we need to come to a point of seeing that our thoughts are not even our thoughts. There are thoughts, they're not existing in anyone else, but what created them is not the conscious sense, the sense of Tom can stand apart from the thoughts, and the thoughts can be seen as just an object arising in consciousness. And so if the feeling and the thoughts start to be seen from this perspective, that means that the structure is changing, and that change can continue such that there can be a complete witnessing of the anxiety, which means anxiety is still there, but the self is not involved in it, and that changes the quality of the uncomfortableness significantly. And eventually the structure from which the anxiety actually arises can dissolve, which means the anxiety itself won't arise. Now, one of the things that has happened with people who are afflicted by a lot of suffering is that the fight against the suffering, because that's a sort of a natural movement until certain information comes into the system, and the desperateness to get away from and to fix the suffering, to fix the anxiety, without even realizing it, that identity has become a hyperdoer. Like, I need to fix this. This is not acceptable. And so I've suggested, like, the notion that what if this never changes? What does that concept feel like? And I wouldn't be surprised if that just creates a sense of terror. But it's creating a sense of terror within that structure that is not really the true self. So that's some good news. It doesn't change the fact that it might seem terrifying. But the reason I bring that up is that the movement has to be towards more and more clarity, more and more reality. Because the egoic structure or the psychological structure is made up of a whole lot of ignorance, really. Not that any of us did it, it's just how life puts that in place, primarily because of this identification of consciousness with the body. And so the admitting that it might never change, so hopefully the terror can, that's sort of a momentary thing when the first set of reactions happen, primarily on the level of that psychological self. But at some point, a surrender to the fact that it's true. Actually, I've spent my whole life, you could say, trying to get rid of anxiety, and it hasn't worked. And the surrender is the surrendering of some of that structure. And we might not realize that for the most part, that structure is doing the very opposite of surrendering. It's trying to fix the situation. So that's
oh, I'm sorry. What do you mean by the structure? Sorry.
Well, just the psychological self that feels that it is doing things and that it needs to solve problems, because if it doesn't, it just believes nothing can happen unless it does it. So even the speaking that's happening, so you've asked a question, and the psychological structure that is based on the belief of personal doership is convinced that it was in control of asking the question. Like that question that you just said, what do you mean by the structure? And that question is not being asked by anyone. So it's quite a radical concept. The question happened, and the psychological self has no explanation as to how something could happen without me doing it, especially something like a question or a behavior or a feeling. Its presupposition is if I speak, it's because I did it. If I feel happy, it's because I made myself feel happy. If I feel sad, it's because I made myself feel sad. If I was kind to someone, it's because um, I made that, I was in control of being kind. And so the core of the structure that suffers is the belief in personal doership. And so the core of this teaching is saying the belief in personal doership is completely out of line with the reality of who we are and how life happens, who or what we are and how life happens.
Yeah. And you said at the beginning of our conversation that anxiety is less related or has less of a connection to doership than the other forms of suffering, guilt, blame, and pride.
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by that?
Well, when I said it, I sort of realized it probably wasn't the best thing to say because anxiety is they're all a hybrid of each other, or they're a hybrid of the two false ideas are the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So blame is you hurt me, so I hate you. Shame is I failed at relationship, at career, and so I hate myself at whatever, interacting, social interaction, whatever. I'm not good enough. So it's either I'm not good enough or the other is not good enough. The way that they are, the way that they behaved, the way they functioned. And so that you can see that very attitude, the attitude of blame, the attitude of guilt and shame, is based on a belief I am the doer. If the belief I am the doer and the other is the doer wasn't there, the notion of blame and shame in the way that it arises just wouldn't have a foundation to arise. But so pride is based on the same attitude of personal doership, but instead of being an attitude towards negative outcomes, it's to do with the same attitude of personal doership, but look what I achieved. I'm so good. I made this happen. So we can see guilt, blame, and pride all primarily based on the belief in doership, although it also relates to outcomes. I hate you because you, I don't know, stole my money. I hate myself because I didn't say the right thing in such and such a situation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, but the other worry and anxiety and attachment to outcomes tends to be more a belief that I need a certain outcome in order to be complete, and that conception, the thought of an outcome not happening, seems like a complete attack on who I am. And so that's why I say that the worry is primarily a form of suffering based on attachment to outcome. Attachment to outcome really means a deeply ingrained belief that says, I will cease to exist without that. So it feels like an existential threat.
This is just one last question, if that's okay. Would you agree that it's possible to, I'm not really sure how to formulate this question now. I want to ask a question around predestiny and anxiety. So there's a noticing that there's anxiety in the system, and then there can be a thought that comes in, okay, this is here as part of destiny, as part of God's will, and therefore less involvement in it or a partial surrender to it. Do you have any thoughts on that? I didn't formulate that very well, but I think you get the gist.
Well, very much. I mean, that concept is a concept that is included and is very useful because it attacks the concept that this is my doing. So if it's God's will, then the doer can, take a break from beating itself up. Whereas if that concept isn't there, what happens is the doer has no other explanation than this is here because I'm failing at preventing it from being here.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Tom. On this notion of predetermination, this was another of the nuances I wanted to bring up. Things sometimes are taken too literally, or it's not about taking them literally. It's like we need to know on what basis. So let me just. Someone could argue that the notion of predetermination, especially if it's described because everything is a sequence of cause and effect, and therefore, just like the balls on a billiard table, when the cue strikes the ball, everything moves according to the laws of physics. And to the observer, it might look like it's random, but if you plugged in all of the information into a computer that understands the laws of physics, the computer will tell you where all the balls will end up, and it will match exactly what actually happens on the table, assuming all the variables that were entered into the computer, what angle the cue hit the ball, how hard it hit the ball, etc. So from that point of view, we can understand that what happens on the table is predetermined by the conditions that existed at the beginning. And I think that is maybe hard for some intellects to grasp. And if an intellect processes it and gets it, it goes, that's unbelievable, especially if the intellect realizes that thinking is, from one perspective, is a process of physics, electromagnetic impulses in a neural network, not much different in very basic principle as water running through a pipe, affected and determined by the laws of physics. So the water won't run uphill, for example, unless there's a force pulling it uphill. And so our thinking and all the movements in the body, including the environment, we can see the environment was this way because of all of the things that came before. And so we could say that the environment could have been anything, but it couldn't be anything because it is what it is because of everything that was before. However, if things were different before, then what we see now would be different. But given things weren't different, then what is here now is inevitable and predetermined by what came before. So that's a description of predetermination supported by a mechanistic explanation of physics. Now, someone might come along and say, well, quantum physics doesn't include mechanistic principles. Quantum physics includes the principle of randomness or spontaneous and non-causal movement. And so therefore things can't be predetermined on the basis of mechanistic cause and effect, because quantum physics, on the level of quantum physics, cause and effect is not part of the quantum rules. So this explanation of predetermination is invalid or false. And so I always say, well, we have to keep the levels, keep everything on the same level. And the fact that quantum rules exist doesn't mean that mechanical physics rules don't exist. They coexist. And they're not contradictory, but complementary. They are two expressions of the one thing. And so explaining life as predetermined to the intellect that functions, at least in part, on the physical level where things consistently appear to follow the rules of cause and effect, determined and confined by the laws of physics, then we can say everything is predetermined. And what's important is that from the perspective of the person that, or the consciousness that becomes aware of what happens was predetermined. Even if we take the perspective of quantum physics and say it's all random, so there's no cause and effect, that what happens in this moment is indeterminable. From the one that it appears in front of, the awareness, the human awareness, or even if we realize that the awareness that we call the human awareness is an awareness coming from the self or source, that it's not confined to the body necessarily, to that awareness in experience, in our experience, what happened was not created by us, but essentially from the point of view of the one that becomes aware of it, it was predetermined, but not necessarily on all levels mechanistically. We can say it was predetermined even in the sense that it came out of randomness. So another word on a level to make it less confusing, on another level, we could say it was inevitable instead of predetermined. And so my point was that becoming too pedantic about a concept, we need to understand why the concept is used, and is the concept wrong in the context in which it is being used and for the purpose which it's being used. So the primary purpose here is to point out to the ego that believes it is the creator and it is the one in control, to point out that you are not the creator or the one in control, either because things are mechanistic or because of it's quantum. In either case, the reason is not you. And in fact, you are in and of yourself an output of one of those two, or a combination of those. You could just say because of reality, but what you are is an output of reality. The awareness of the human arising has happened. And so if we can find ourself aware of ourself as a happening, that's impressive. Ooh. it's late. I see Melissa raised her hand, but we're over time, and I try not to go over time. So maybe next week, Melissa, if the question is still pertinent. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope, so next week I won't be offering a satsang, and the next one is on the 15th of June. Well, next week I will be offering a satsang on this at this time, starting 2 hours earlier than this time, and then for the 6 days or 5 days after that. So that's part of the 6-day intensive. So I hope to see some of you there, and